Hello, my name is Simon Tong, and this is my lab report on lab number 2 for Physics 2212. So before I get started, I'm going to do a quick recap of lab number 1 because lab number 2 very much built on lab number 1. So in lab number 1, the purpose of the lab was to show how electric fields interacted with each other and how electric forces affected objects. To do this, two pieces of tape were charged and shown to repel from each other. Because the tapes were in static equilibrium, the electric field of the tape could be solved for when taking into account all the forces acting on it and realizing that an object in static equilibrium has a net force of 0. To charge the pieces of tape for lab 1, we first made a base tape and stuck it on the table, and then took a second piece of tape and placed it on top of the base tape. We then ripped the second piece of tape off, pulling up free electrons with it, adding charge to that top tape. This was repeated for a second piece of tape, and then these two pieces of tape were put so they were facing away from each other so that charges would repel, as seen in that picture above. This was meant that the two pieces of tape were in static equilibrium, and the only forces acting on them were the force of gravity, on the top tape at least, were the force of gravity and the electric force from the bottom tape. The formulas below were then used to solve for the electric field of the tape. On to lab number 2. So the purpose of this lab was to show how charges on actual objects work, because they don't act as point charges as we assumed in the lab before. To do this, we had to calculate it by splitting up the piece of tape into many different sections and solving for the charge of each section. So calculus comes into this because you want to be able to split up that piece of tape into many little pieces so to minimize your error. And computer models can aid in this as they can split it up into almost infinite many pieces and solve for those electric fields. GlowScript very much aided in this lab because we were able to improve our GlowScript skills immensely by doing this, and it actually helps in the calculations as well as being able to visualize what is actually happening as you are trying to solve for these electric fields. So this is my GlowScript model of what is actually happening, and as you can see, it is broken up into all those green arrows represent the electric field of just that one little piece of charged tape. And as you can see, the total electric force and the force of gravity are still the exact same size as they cancel out because the object is still in static equilibrium. So we then had to ask ourselves a couple of questions. The first was, what if you had modeled each of your tapes as a single point charge like in the previous lab, and compare the estimated value of the charge you get when you use your experimental data to produce a point charge model to the value you got with your line charge model. So if we modeled the tapes as a point charge like was done in lab 1, the distribution of the charge throughout the piece of tape would not be able to be seen because it would be originating from just one singular point. The estimated value from lab 1 was very close to making the net force 0. However, that number had to be tweaked because splitting the tape up into more and more point charges amplified the error. The second question was, why do these estimates differ? Which value is more likely to be closer to the real value and why? So I thought these estimates differ because the error is amplified through breaking the tape up into more and more pieces. The line charge model is more likely to be closer to the real value as it more accurately models the charge distribution of the tape, right? Because the tape is not a singular point in space, but actually like a true line, so that obviously the line charge would model it better. The first conclusion I drew was that splitting the line charge up into more and more pieces actually amplified the error. And I'm not 100% sure why this happened, but I was thinking it was most likely because more and more point charges meant more and more error in between each one. And as you can see in my two pictures to the right, just how great the error could be, because you could end up splitting up into very many pieces. And the final conclusion I made was that GlowScript is a very useful tool to be used in modeling different situations. It is much more precise than any calculations we could do by hand And so it is a great tool to use to get more accurate calculations.